Hello and welcome to Spotify Advertising's loveAudio Sip and Sound session. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Brian Rotuno, Director of Client Partnerships for the CPG and Spirits category here at Spotify. We've got an exciting session which is part real-time insights, part inspiration, and part entertainment. First, we'll take a deep dive into an emerging, untapped listening moment that we believe spirits brands can leverage in a major way, nostalgia. Then we'll get to hear from a few special guests along the way. More on that in a minute, but for now, a big thank you to our advertising partners and future partners, as none of this would be possible without your interest in Spotify and our work together. Okay, let's check out what's spinning on today's playlist. To kick us off, I'm going to be joined by Annie Evans, Global CPG and Spirits Category Development Officer at Spotify. We'll be diving into how nostalgia is coming back through what consumers are sipping and streaming, leaving you with insights and inspiration on how to reach your audiences. Next, we'll have a lively and interactive discussion about the power of audio for both brands and creators with some special guests. The Ringer's Bill Simmons, Molson Coors' Brad Feinberg, and Campari's Sean Yell, moderated by our own Melissa Finney. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Annie Evans, the Global CPG and Spirits Category Development Officer. I'm thrilled to be here with you today, and to date myself right out of the gate, I'm sporting the acid wash look as an ode to my love for the 80s. Now, you might be sitting at home there wondering what nostalgia has to do with alcohol. Well, at Spotify, our first-party data tells us that nostalgia is coming back through what consumers are sipping and streaming. Before we dive in, let's talk about how alcohol and audio go hand in hand. From holidays and parties to vacations and dinner with friends, Spotify is the soundtrack to our lives. Our listeners are DJing through their phones, smart speakers, TVs, gaming devices, all while enjoying a drink, giving your brand an opportunity to connect with real people in real moments. On Spotify, your audience is actively seeking out nostalgia, no matter what they're drinking. Despite the differences between beer, bourbon, seltzer, tequila, and vodka drinkers, they are all throwing it back on Spotify now more than ever. In 2020, and what holds true today, is what we turn to familiar brands that we rely on when things are uncertain. We were nostalgic for better times and tried to access our past selves by recreating our favorite drinks at home. As Drizzly's head of consumer insights said, familiar brands benefited from consumers turning to their tried and true favorites. Now in 2021, with the roller coaster of reopenings, we see brands and bartenders leveraging nostalgia, but with a twist of innovation, mixing the past with the present. From peanut butter whiskey, spiked popsicles, to lemonade seltzers and chocolate bourbon, classic alcohol brands are infusing flavors with old school comforts. Consumers are not only craving nostalgia through what they're pouring, but also what they're playing. Music is the #1 trigger, and for me, it's New Kids on the Block hanging tough. It has an ongoing presence in memorable moments. Think of your first school dance or soundtrack to your family's road trips. Reminiscing on the past brings a strong emotional reaction. In our research, almost 70% of people surveyed agreed that nostalgia can help improve their mood and reconnects them with the past. Brian, tell us more how this plays a role on Spotify.
Thanks, Annie. So all the trends and mindsets you just described, not surprisingly, show up in our streaming data in a variety of ways that we think brands can really take advantage of. For example, we see that listeners are the most nostalgic for songs that were popular or that were released in their mid to late teenage years. After that age, they listen less to the music of the time and continue to listen to the music of what they consider to be their time, the music they listened to as teens. To illustrate this, let's take a look at a growing demo on Spotify, 35 to 44-year-olds, who also happen to make up a significant percent of drinkers on the platform. We saw that this audience over-indexed highlighting music from the early 90s through the early 2000s. And when we dove into this data just a little bit deeper and split out our audience by their preferred cocktail or spirit, we found that the 90s and 2000 moments were actually the top over-indexing moments overall of any moment that we track in our streaming data for each of these audiences, showing that across the board, drinkers on Spotify are happily stuck in a time capsule now more than ever. Our data also allows us to dive even more granularly into microgenre data that brands can leverage for targeting and to ensure authenticity of their message. Regardless of your drink of choice, we see that the top indexing microgenre for drinkers on the platform is rap rock, which is actually a microgenre that went mainstream in the early 90s and hit its golden age in the late 90s with bands like Run DMC and Beastie Boys. It's easy to understand why nostalgia is so in right now with the demographics who grew up with the music of the past. But you also might be wondering about how this trend plays with the younger 21 to 34 LDA audience that so many of our spirits brands are looking to connect with. It turns out we're seeing that this group is streaming more playlists devoted to the sounds of decades ago as well. Popping in a big way currently are some playlists that include 70s love songs, 80s rock anthems, and 80s hits. We know our audience uses these playlists to escape the realities and chaos of today, but it's actually not just music that does this for them. Podcasts can play a big role too. Annie's going to tell us a little more on this and then provide you with some thought starters for how we recommend that marketers action on some of the insights you've heard today.
Your audience presses play on all things back in the day, including podcasts. The two top indexing podcast categories for beer, bourbon, seltzer, tequila, and vodka drinkers are true crime and sports. These categories often play up the past, whether they're diving into a decade-old cold case or reminiscing on record-breaking baseball plays. We've seen how that emotional, nostalgic connection with a brand can lead to success on Spotify. In late 2020, a beer brand leveraged Hostries voiced by Bill Simmons, who you will hear from shortly. Bill talked about his history with the brand and admitting to a lifelong passion for the beer. The personal ads that delved into his past struck a chord with the audience, driving deeper engagement and an increase in brand love. Whether you're trying to reach a drinker who's still rocking out to the 90s or playing detective with true crime podcasts, we've got some best practices on how to turn back time on Spotify. First, evoke emotion. All of our senses can trigger memories, so tell your brand story through sight, sound, and motion. Second, keep it fresh. Fuse old and new by partnering with an emerging artist for their new take on an old genre or a new podcast host that dives deep into the past. Lastly, embrace eras of the brand's history. For example, Johnny Walker celebrated their 110th anniversary by celebrating a musical time travel experience on Spotify where users discovered what they would have listened to in the past eras with personalized playlists. Now, turning things over to Brian, who will be welcoming our exciting panel lineup.
Thanks, Annie. Hopefully the insights we've just shared with you help to inspire you as you strategize around how to reach your audiences where they're tuned in a real, authentic way. Now, switching gears, I'm honored and excited to introduce my partner, Melissa Finney, Director of Client Partnerships for the CPG and Spirits category here at Spotify, to take us from here. Melissa, the virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you, Brian, for that introduction. I'm excited to be here and ready to welcome a few special guests to the virtual stage. Joining us from the West Coast, Bill Simmons, founder and managing director of The Ringer. As a successful podcaster, columnist, author, TV host, and analyst, you've become the voice of a generation of American sports fans. And in 2016, you launched The Ringer. From there, the Ringer Films division with documentaries such as Andre the Giant, the most watched documentary in HBO sports history. And most recently, Woodstock 99, Peace, Love, and Rage. We're lucky to have you here today. And Brad Feinberg. Thanks for being here, Bill. And Brad Feinberg, North American VP for Media and Consumer Engagement at Molson Coors. Brad, in your 12 years at Molson Coors, you've contributed to the turnaround of Miller Lite, as well as spearheading the launch of Volt Studio, the Molson Coors in-house creative agency. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And to round out our panel, welcome Sean Yell, Senior Category Director, Dark Spirits at Campari. Sean, you've spent the last decade marketing some of the world's largest and most beloved spirit brands, Wild Turkey, Smirnoff, and Captain Morgan. Currently, you lead the award-winning whiskey and rum portfolio at Campari America with a wide range of partnerships. Well, we're thrilled to have you join us today. So, I'm really liking this regional representation we have going on. We have Bill in California, Brad in Chicago, and Sean and I are holding it down in New York City. Plus a mix of creators and brands, liquor and beer. So let's dive in, guys. So before we hit our panel, our guests learned how audiences are actively seeking out nostalgic content. Music is the #1 trigger for nostalgia. We soundtrack our lives, from casual dinner parties to vacations, which also means we soundtrack our memories. So, Bill, we're going to start with you. Over the last year with COVID, a lot of 80s and 90s hits were streaming comfort and memories, and the trend is continuing. But podcast listening also grew substantially. You were able to retain and grow a massive audience, even as live sports ceased to exist. Do you think that that's because of shows like Rewatchables and their connection to nostalgia, or do you think that your podcasts were just able to offer something that your audiences really needed in this moment?
I mean, it was probably partly boredom, because I think especially the first few months, people were stuck at home, not doing a lot. But I think we learned a lot about just how to do our business during the pandemic that we didn't even really realize we could do. Like being able to tape podcasts remotely and stuff like that. But I think, to me, I felt like the podcast boom was going to keep happening regardless of the pandemic or not, because this is now like a 15-year thing. I had my podcast started in 2007. It was something that I just noticed on ESPN, and I wanted to have it just because I thought it'd be fun to interview people. Never expected it to become anything. And within 2 years, I had people stopping me on the street, or people who had their headphones on, pointing their headphones, saying they were listening to me. And I'm like, what's going on here? I think there's an intimacy to it that people, you're part of their day. You're in their commute. You're there when they're working out. You're there when they're just driving around, going to pick up their daughter or something. And I think when you talk about brands and how they get integrated with that, it's such an intimate experience a lot of the time that when you're in the middle of a conversation, you're taking a break to talk about a brand for a minute, the people they're kind of trapped with you, but we also try to make it so that it's fun for them to listen to whatever we're talking about. So I think I just look at it like it's a really smart way for brands to connect with people directly and try to push whatever they care about for that year.
Absolutely, and I'm sure Sean and Brad agree, but at least I hope that they do. Gentlemen, how do you see nostalgia playing a role in your campaigns? Sean,
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sorry, I'll go first. I think nostalgia is a tricky one, right? Like you want to make sure that your brand feels, in touch and kind of with today's consumer, but it can't be a one size fits all, and you have to make sure how you're bringing it to life. So if I think about like Wild Turkey, this old dusty brand that, when I first started, I didn't really know much about, but it truly is this beautiful story of like a family run business through 70 years been making whiskey one way, the right way. You tell this to consumers in the kind of that fashion, like their eyes glaze over. There's like, okay, so it's more older white gentlemen making whiskey. Don't care, don't want to be part of it. But if you can actually kind of bring the good of the nostalgia forward in terms of like what are the values of the yesteryear that kind of brings it to life, well, all of a sudden, like now there's a modern and reasonable way, like people want to kind of, to appreciate that. It resonates. And so all of a sudden it feels like yes, there are values been brought forward that now belong in the here and now. And being able to find kind of the right partners and the right conversations, whether it's kind of, podcasts or kind of other sponsorships, I think that's the real trick and the real key of how we're able to kind of make that flip. Brad, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, when you describe, or when I hear the word nostalgia as a trend, I would say from a marketer's perspective or from my perspective, like I would describe that as like heritage or timelessness. And we have a subsegment of brands in our portfolio that have a long and storied history. Brands like Coors Banquet, Miller High Life, Miller Lite, and even Coors Light. And I mean, these are brands that have been around for 45 or more years, right? So inherently, they have nostalgia ingrained in them. And we see it as marketers that it's our responsibility, just as like, I would say, just as Bill described in a lot of ways, to introduce these great brands to the next generation of legal drinking age consumers. And so that shows up in our marketing in many different ways. Like our packaging, for one, reflects our heritage. We made a decision about 4, maybe even 5 years ago to reintroduce the original look and feel for Miller Lite. And it was a tremendous success. And packaging on its own doesn't, make a brand. It's the liquid inside of it as well as it relates to us. But that connection to our history, or that look and feel, did a lot to our core drinkers who pick us up regularly, and it did a lot for the next generation of drinkers. And we did the same thing for Coors Banquet with its unique stubby bottle, and the soft cross and the clear iconic bottle for Miller High Life also kind of reflects that. And that also shows up in the way we merchandise our brand, with branded merchandise and like branded wearables, I would call it, as well as partnerships and product placements that we do that feels authentic to the environment and ties really closely to each brand's unique positioning. So if you haven't seen Cobra Kai on Netflix, as a good example, you know that Coors Banquet is the preferred beverage for Johnny Lawrence on the show, and that, we just recently, this last Father's Day, Miller Lite created a shoezy, which is basically a shoe koozie, in partnership with another iconic heritage brand in New Balance. And so those are examples that our brand is connected to, I would say, nostalgia and how we bring it to life.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And sweep the leg, right? I mean, no mercy. I love it.
Yeah, exactly.
So we just touched on how audio plays a pivotal role in connecting consumers to the past and what that means for creating content and campaigns. It's incredibly intimate, especially in comparison to traditional television and radio and other mediums. Ultimately, it deepens relationships between creators and fans, brands and consumers. Bill, as someone who spent their entire career as a creator, and especially one of the first true creators in the podcasting space, what is it about audio that really spoke to you, and how is it a different medium for storytelling?
So I think what's cool about audio right now is it's still going in a bunch of different directions that I don't really know the answers to all the questions yet. But like, we're experimenting right now with shorter podcasts. Like, we're doing an Olympics podcast right now that it's like 12 to 15 minutes long, and it's just a daily recap. We have other podcasts like Basketball, Reacting, and Free Agency that can be 2 hours. We're doing a Siskel and Ebert narrative podcast right now. We just did a Len Bias narrative podcast. So it all goes back to the basic things of how do we stay in the conversations that people are having? How do we help push those conversations? How do we help lead them? How are we just there when things are happening, which you've seen over and over again with us, like NBA draft, NBA finals. I was up after basically every big playoff game for my Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday pod, putting at least the first 25 minutes coming off some game so I could react to some news, because you want to be what people are talking about. So you have that. And then you also have the innovation piece too, and how to think a little more big picture, a little bit ahead. And I think for us, like pop culture, there was a lot of experimentation that we did really well in, right? Like, we were there early on a show like The Bachelor. We had the first big Bachelor podcast. The Rewatchables is the biggest movie podcast, and that's just a podcast about movies, but taps into a lot of the nostalgia we're talking about. Trying to over and over again be a little bit ahead of where things are going, I think, is the most fun part of this. Like, we created this podcast this year called The Ringerverse, which was basically an extension of a podcast we created during Game of Thrones called Binge Mode, where heading into one of the last Game of Thrones seasons, we did basically an episode by episode breakdown of every Game of Thrones thing, but by two people who were obsessed with the series, who just saw things that you wouldn't have seen if you were watching it for the first time or the second time. And that did really well. And we tapped into a fandom that was really fascinating to us with that. And that kind of led to the Ringerverse pod this year, where it's like, you have all these Marvel movies, you have Lord of the Rings, you have Star Wars, you have Mandalorian. This has become like a third vertical for us. We were sports and pop culture, but I think nerd culture has become the third vertical. So we spent a lot of time thinking, all right, what is this? How do we treat this like we treat sports, basically? And that's what led to the Ringerverse and some of the other ideas we have coming, where Loki goes up and we have a reaction podcast within 2 hours, the same way I had a reaction podcast last night about NBA free agency. So I think the innovation is what's really cool, and finding new voices and kind of trying to figure out how to be creative, how to find talent. It's not really much different than a website or what people are trying to do with documentaries or movies, things like that. It's been really fun for us. It's been fun to be one of the leaders.
Do you have a particular way that you want a brand to engage with you and your audience if they're going to be featured on one of your podcasts?
Yeah, it could go one of two ways. We were actually talking about this before the panel started. Like sometimes a brand will just come to us and say, "Here's what we're doing." Like, this is coming out in September, and do these reads, and that's it. I think, and we're happy to do that, and it usually works. I think where we've had a lot of success has been having the brands actually talk to us and spitball with us, and it's something we haven't been able to do during the pandemic. But when we were at the Ringer, that was a huge advantage for us because we would have them come in. We would sit around at a table. We would hear what they're always thinking like 8, 9 months ahead, right? In September, we have this, we care about this. This is what we want to start thinking about. And then just kind of spitballing ideas. We have some creative people on our side and trying to figure out like, oh, what if we do a contest or what if we do this tied into this? And it's much easier to do it that way than to just be sent some Word document that has like the 5 bullet points.
Yep.
We can do either, but I think when we're able to actually interact with the sponsor and if they're thinking about it the right way, we can really create some cool stuff. And I think the proof in the pudding for us is we've had a lot of people who've stayed with us, for a few years that keep coming back, including Miller Lite, who's part of Molson Coors. But I think we've just figured out ways to integrate the messages that the brands want in ways that feel organic to them and to us. So that's always the goal with this stuff.
Absolutely. And Brad, you have been integral in that Miller Lite integration with The Ringer. What about podcasts makes it a must in your marketing strategy, especially as you're launching new products or looking to deepen brand loyalty?
Yeah, I mean, it building off of what Bill said and even my last comments on nostalgia, it all starts with authenticity and brand purpose. And so we review opportunities and create partnerships in content spaces that resonate with our consumers. Because ultimately we're trying to create connection with the consumer, right? And using the podcast or the talents, the host of the show, in their authentic voice as like surrogates for our brand, right? And to bring our brand voice to life. And so that helps us showcase that voice and that talent. And as you said, like partnerships we have with like Bill and the Ringer for Miller Lite are good examples of that. And ultimately we want to be, when you think about podcasts and media in general is a media professional, we want to be in the right places where our consumers are spending their time. And regardless if it's a new brand or an established one, we feel that it's one of these environments where podcasting has become an environment. It has the scale today and it's grown at an incredible rate over the last 3 years. It really gives us the opportunity to story tell our brands in a way that resonates with the consumers. And ultimately, that's what matters most when you're a marketer.
Yeah, I mean, Brad,
And then the other thing that's happened is just over the last 15 years, the people that are now in decision-making spots for companies and brands are younger and more likely to listen to podcasts. Like when I had my podcast the first 5 years, it was a bunch of people whose kids were listening to podcasts, but they didn't know who they were. And you could tell by the brands that we had on the pod. Subway was the only one that was like that even remotely understood it the first few years. And then we've seen such a shift. And now you look at the people that are involved in our pods now, they're all A-list companies. That was not the case 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was like Bob's Homemade Vodka. And it was like these things you've never heard of, mattress companies that you didn't even know if they actually existed. And now it's like real brands. So that's been cool to watch.
It was one of the interesting things on that, building up what Bill just said, is that one of the total 100% agree, and it was my kids and them, listening to podcasts that kind of definitely cued me in on it. But also, there's a lot of direct to consumer brands that are heavily invested in podcasts, and those are some of the fastest growing businesses. Period. And so when you're like, you have to say like, they're growing, they're spending a lot in this space. Maybe we should too. And so that definitely, I think, has attracted a lot of, I would say, quote unquote, traditional marketers into the space.
Absolutely. I mean, we've all come a long way from Bob's homemade vodka, right, guys? So,
Yeah,
Sean, Sean, how does audio innovation?
Do you sell Bob's homemade vodka?
yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend
Maybe
him.
that's a new brand. Maybe it's a new brand.
It's blowing up in Harlem, guys. I got to tell you, you know. So, Sean, tell me how audio innovation really plays into how you are connecting your brands with your consumer, and most importantly, let's talk about how podcasts are changing the way you're considering audio.
Yeah, I think I'm going to underline kind of a lot of what both Brad and Bill said here, but I think we put it through kind of three filters. Context, the story I want to tell about my brand, and kind of the value I'm bringing to the conversation. Most importantly, right? I think context for us matters. If we think about our brands a lot as kind of brand owners, I guarantee you our consumers barely think about us at all. So it's making sure that it's clear on why we're in this conversation. It matters. So if we're have a Long Branch whiskey surrounding an MLS soccer podcast, nobody cares, and it's kind of just disregarded right away. But all of a sudden, if you're able to explain, well, this is Matthew McConaughey's whiskey. He's a partial owner of Austin FC, and he's kind of deeply involved in this space. Like, okay, I get it now. I understand the connection, why it's there, and how the passion point comes to life. So I think being able to kind of make sure and be choiceful on that. And I think secondly, in terms of the story I want to tell about my brand, it matters. Like, being choiceful in the conversations, the podcast you enter into. We have a conversation coming up with NPR's Code Switch in a couple of months. And you kind of know what Code Switch is all about. And we have a brand called Russell's Reserve that wants to knock down the barriers and the walls that we've constructed for ourselves on making bourbon about kind of for Southern white gentlemen. Like, that's BS. Like, we believe that there should be access for people who, for all, gender orientations as well as kind of races. Like, no, you should have access to super premium. So bourbon, let's actually have that conversation and have some shared goals with that podcast to get really rich, because consumers are choosing the podcast. They're not choosing Russell's Reserve in that podcast. So let's make sure we're additive into that and being choiceful in it. And I think also it's, what are we bringing to the conversation? We're talking about podcasts, but we've actually created a voice skill for Wild Turkey. And so effectively it's an at-home tasting approach. So you say, Alexa, give me a Wild Turkey tasting skill. And it has our master distillers walking you through each variant, as you kind of like, I no longer smell kind of alcohol and it tastes like bourbon. It's like, no, I smell the coffee. I smell the vanilla notes. But I understand why, because it's coming from my master distillers. And for our whiskey geeks who get really, really enthused about this is access they couldn't get otherwise. And now it's at scale and it actually matters. So I think it's the ability to kind of bring value to that conversation rather than being in it. I think is kind of one of the critical things that we look for and how we kind of choose some of our partners.
It's really cool to be able to really offer up all of the senses in a voice skill. It's very cool. Brad, we're going to move on to music. I know a lot of your brands lean into music as a pillar for marketing. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, music, it shouldn't be a surprise, is that it's highly influential in many different ways across many of our brands and across many genres. And I think we learned years ago that a brand or a set of brands can't really focus on just one genre of music, and that we have to be careful not alienating our consumers by associating ourselves with one genre. Though I do think this newer generation is more multi-dimensional in their music experiences and listens to many different things, and they're not one trick pony type of artists or areas. And so I think that has opened the door to like reach and associate with music in many different ways. Live events, as you can imagine, are key spaces where our products and consumers, kind of interact with each other. Our brands, when we're at live music events, can become part of the fabric of that long-lasting memory that was created while you're at that event, whether it's with your friends or your significant other. And we sponsor events like Jazz Fest, Summer Fest in Milwaukee, and the Made in America Festival, which we're sponsoring this year. So we get involved in definitely in the festival space, because that's an area where there's a lot of opportunity to reach consumers. And then we've also worked with musicians who love our brands and want to be ambassadors. And we just launched a new brand called Proofpoint, where we partnered with Rock Nation specifically and high-profile artists like Meek Mills which to us that sticks out because it's one of the first brands where we've actually used music as the core of its marketing strategy and leveraging and partnering with artists that kind of bring to life the essence of the brand, and that ultimately is where music fits in. It also shows up on the tracks in our commercials or in other things, and so music is just it's ever present in a lot of what we do.
Thank you so much for that, Brad. And actually, you're bringing me to the next question. I'm going to move ahead a little bit, specifically about sports and live events. So we've talked so much about nostalgic and podcasts. I want to talk about how the world has completely changed with sports and live music coming back, even though everything that's going on in the world. So there's always been a link between sports and alcohol, and audiences and consumers instinctively connect the two. Sean, what does the reemergence of live sports mean for your brands specifically? Is like life and planning going to return to pre-COVID for you, or do you believe consumer habits have changed forever?
I think realistically, there's some things have undoubtedly changed. You can't spend 17 months, partially in and partially not, huddling at home and being afraid of walking outside without that impacting people in the long term. But I think it brings two opportunities up. I think one is that for those who have been at home, they didn't kind of stop living. They want to continue experiencing, and they've actually kind of chosen to upskill themselves and being able to kind of enjoy what they normally get at a bar or at a sporting event at home. So I think it's us being able to have the ability to kind of teach these people how to make cocktails, show them how it comes to life, when and where and how you drink it, so that they can appreciate it. Like, let's be realistic. Like, you're sitting down to watch a football game at home, like most likely you're going to open a beer. But if you can actually provide like the permission, the context, like, hey, you know what? It's kind of okay to have a Aperol spritz or another cocktail with it. It provides it to allow it to happen. Secondly,
Sean,
I think it's as people.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Go
I was just going to say, because when I think football, I think Aperol spritz all day.
You've been hanging out with me enough then, huh?
Please continue. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, all good. But I think secondly, people are continuing to be outside. Like Lollapalooza this past weekend, it was a bananas. It was crazy. And consumers still want to have that experience. It's something we're talking about, kind of almost revenge conviviality. People are dying to be back out and together. So, it provides us, we have to solve for that as well. And I think at the end of the day, it's forced us to be kind of more agile and targeted in what we're doing. Purpose of your larger brand goals, but solving for the needs of that consumer at that time and where they're at.
Awesome. I feel like you took the words right out of my mouth. Revenge conviviality. I mean, I literally was just about to, what about you, Brad? How is life going to go back to normal or not for you and your brands as you think about sports and live events?
Yeah, I mean, live sports are a core established space for our category and our brands. And similar to what Sean described, like, I don't think post-COVID, or not even sure we can say we're in post-COVID yet, habits are going to be forever changed. And I also don't think we'll go back exactly the way pre-COVID was everything. So I've always felt like the ground shifted and like we've established as somewhat of a new normal or new behaviors. And I think those will probably stick around for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I do think people are really eager to go out and do things that they did before, and live sporting events is one way to experience those types of things from an entertainment standpoint. And so we're very thankful for the reemergence of live sporting events because we sell a lot of products in stadiums and at bars where people get together to watch with their friends. But I also expect it will be just as easy to have a case of beer delivered to your house via something like Drizzly to watch the game with your friends instead. And so our job is to make sure that we fit in all of those occasions and make sure that our brands resonate there.
Absolutely. And Bill, how are you thinking about what's next, and how does it impact the content you choose and how you engage in your audiences? Are you planning for life after COVID, or are you also thinking about what happens if everything shuts down again?
We were kind of built for this, dating back to the Grantland days of we were built around sports and pop culture, and there were always these windows in the schedule that it just was kind of dead, where nothing was happening. There would be like a week in February there'd be 2 weeks in August. So we kind of learned because we kind of moved to the rhythms of the schedule. So you kind of learn when there's a dead week like that, you have to have stuff. So we started doing theme weeks or, whatever else to try to create content in lieu of, nothing going on. I think the pandemic, we used every trick we had the first couple months there because nothing was going on. And I was doing 2 rewatchables a week, and we were doing redrafts of old NBA drafts from like 1996 and re-ranking them. And we just did, it's funny we're talking about nostalgia. That was all we did for 2.5 months. And then slowly stuff started coming back. So now, now we're in another dead stretch again because football doesn't start for another month. Baseball, people really are more focused on September and October for baseball than anything else. And then basketball is going to kind of go in hibernation for a few weeks here. So we have a bunch of stuff planned and a bunch of, pop culture stuff and nerd culture stuff, things like that. So we're always ready. But to us, it's like the best times for us are always when October to December, where you have like basketball's coming back, football's in full swing. It's the height of the movie season. The prestige TV shows are coming out. There's a lot of near the end of the year music being released. The award shows are coming. That's when it's just easy to do this if you have the right people. So we kind of move to the rhythm of whatever is going on. But if this shuts down again, I still feel like sports is going to happen. It'll just be probably without fans like it was the last time. So they're going to adjust. There's too much money at stake. I'm not concerned about no football or anything like that. It's happening regardless.
Absolutely, and if things do go that way, fans are going to need shows like yours more than ever. So before I even open it up to audience questions, I got to ask you guys, what are we drinking these days? Sean, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think, kind of evening cocktail, a little apple and estate daiquiri. Super simple to make, just really nice and balanced. And it's kind of like it's an old classic that's kind of fallen out of style, but it is amazing when it's done right. So an apple estate daiquiri is my go-to.
And Brad?
I think it really depends on the occasion, but right now we launched some new products, and one that I'm really loving is Pineapple Topo Chico Hard Seltzer. So it's our partnership with Topo Chico as a brand, and it's delicious. And the other one, because I can't just pick one child, but the other one would be Blue Moon Light Sky. Both are refreshing options, for a really hot summer day.
I feel like Pineapple Topo Chico and Blue Moon are 2 different parties. You know what I'm saying? 2 different guest lists.
Well, it can be, yes, no doubt.
Bill, what are you drinking?
Miller Lite. I'm not just saying that because he's here.
Sure.
It's always in the fridge. Mojitos in the summer.
Okay.
That's probably my favorite. And then there's a lot of rosé in my house that I'm not responsible for. It's on my wife's side, but it's a big rosé. She wants to get a rosé machine, and there's a whole rosé situation going on right now.
Well, rosé and
I don't know where you stand
all
on
day.
rosé machine. Yeah, but that's what I'm dealing with these days.
I feel like they're going to make their way into HGTV, sir, like the new design of, summer, fall. So, okay, with that, we only have time for a few more questions from the audience, so we're going to dive right in. We're going to start from someone at Brown-Forman. So, Mariana Villanova, girl, I hope I got that right. How can you leverage audio as an advertiser when the majority of your assets are actually visual? So I know you guys deal with this every day. So why don't we start with you, Brad? When your assets are visual, how are you leveraging audio?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that a lot of our brands are well-established brands that have 90+% consumer awareness. So the brands are out there in the world, and people get to see them and experience them in many different ways. And so I just always felt audio as a great complement. And it is really, you learned this back when you're studying advertising, audio is theater of the mind. And so I think the best creative overcomes any limitations and any visual cues that are needed. And the expectation is that your consumer is going to see your message in many different ways. And sometimes the audio format is just a support or may even connect with them in a deeper level that the visual can't do.
Absolutely. And Sean, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I have a couple of like just very straightforward answers. One is use the assets you have available to us. We partner with Matthew McConaughey. He has a really iconic voice, so we use that, and he's wonderful. And people kind of like, oh, it's Matthew McConaughey, and like immediately that happens. The second one is like create audio assets. Like it's truly not expensive, and I think Brad said it's the media of the mind, and like if you can sit in a bar, you can stop and close your eyes and think about it. You hear the ice clinking in your glass. You can hear the martini shaker. You can hear kind of the murmured conversations. Like, dive into it. And that's what people are missing. That's what people want. And so, like, make sure you're able to kind of bring it fully to life, and so that full context comes to life for you.
Absolutely. And some of your best partners, like Spotify, will actually make you that asset if you're nice to them.
I've heard about that.
You know, they're going to be big, that Spotify. Okay, so the next question is for Bill. It's from Jason from SJC Media. What channels have been the most successful when building the audience for The Ringer?
What channels? It's funny, Rewatchables does really well. I think the stuff where people know what it is and there's consistencies to it, that's been our biggest advantage dating back to when we launched The Ringer. Most of these brands, they're figuring stuff out 8 to 10 months ahead of time, right? And if you're pitching them some narrative podcast and you're trying to explain what it is and it's 10 episodes, they'll look at that and they'll be like, all right, that sounds cool, but all right, Bill's show is on Sunday night, Tuesday night, Thursday night, every week. We know during football season he does guest alliance. Like they just know what it is. It's easier for them to understand. So I think the ones that we have real consistency on, like Ringer NBA show, it's 4 or 5 times a week. Ringer NFL show during the season is 5 times a week. This Ringerverse pod we created, that's 3 times a week. It's going to move to 4. And we can tell people way ahead of time, yeah, it's going to be during the month that you care about, we have this podcast. It's 3 times a week. It'll be reacting in these ways. So I think the more you can spell out what you have and what the consistency is, it seems like the bigger advantage that is for the relationship with the brand.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay. So guys, that's all the time we have. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Brad. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Take care. Well, that was a great conversation. Turning it back to you, Brian.
Thanks to our panelists, and thanks to all of you for spending some time with Spotify advertising. We hope you found it to be informative, inspiring, entertaining, and you had a little fun. If anything piqued your interest and you want to learn more, please do reach out to us. We'd love to continue the discussion. We appreciate your time and your partnership, and we look forward to working with you more closely. Take care, and thanks again for joining us.